that the U.S. military has seized another vessel that was linked to Iran.
Donald Trump has gone from threatening to bomb Iran.
The U.S. blockade of ships to and from Iranian ports.
Namar Gulf, Dara Island, 84 kilometers from the Narim Strait. Choke point .2:47 in the morning. .2 B-2 bombers, 430 Veyran Revolutionary Maritime Guard security personnel, and 11 minutes before the first regional fighter patrol could begin reacting over the Gulf. The Sadiq complex moved 612,000 barrels of condensate and refined fuel per day, enough to account for nearly a third of Veyran's seaborne energy revenue on a normal shipping cycle. It was protected by coastal surveillance radar, layered point defenses, armed dock patrols, and fast security boats held on standby in the harbor basin through the night. The mission was to shut down the export complex by destroying its control, power, storage, and transfer capacity before defenders could stabilize the site and keep product moving. From the water, the facility looked like a city built entirely for combustion and pressure. Distillation columns rose over the central processing yard in silver stacks, each one banded with red obstruction lights and catwalks that linked tower to tower above a maze of insulated pipe. West of the towers stood the primary storage farm, 10 white-ribbed tanks in 2 rows, each one tied into a buried pumping corridor that fed the export manifold at the shoreline. The control building sat behind a reinforced blast wall on the inland side of the process yard, a hardened rectangle of concrete, glass, relay cabinets, and digital traffic boards. Beyond it stood a gas-fired power block, backup generators, and a switchyard that fed the pumps, tower heaters, valve systems, and loading arms on the pier. The main loading terminal pushed out over dark water on twin trestles, with 4 berths for tankers, 2 crane platforms, and a web of articulated arms that reached toward the sea like rigid steel fingers. Security towers watched the perimeter road. Gun positions covered the pier throat, the tank farm, and the inland approach. Patrol trucks looped the site every 12 minutes. Harbor crews kept searchlights cold unless an alarm sounded, because the guard command believed distance, layered sensors, and open water made the terminal effectively immune to a sudden strike. Every full day of shutdown at Sadiq cost Veyran an estimated $48 million in lost exports, delays, penalties, and emergency diversion. The strike plan focused on 4 systems that kept Sadiq alive as an export hub. The first was the central control block, where operators managed pressure, routing, alarms, and emergency shutdowns across the site. The second was the tank farm, because storage capacity determined whether incoming product could be buffered or whether upstream fields would have to choke production. The third was the export manifold and primary transfer junction, where inland pipeline flow met the shoreside loading network. The fourth was the power generation and distribution cluster, because without electricity the pumps, valves, cooling systems, and digital controls would fail in sequence. The objective was not to erase the terminal from the map. It was to force a long outage by collapsing the systems that allowed crude derivatives and condensate to be processed, held, routed, and loaded in a controlled chain. U.S. planners divided the strike into 4 effects. Alpha would blind the site's ability to see clearly by collapsing surveillance, communications, and the command rhythm that tied the defenders together. Bravo would break the power architecture and plunge the process yard into a degraded state where pumps and automated valves could no longer operate with precision. Charlie would cripple the storage and transfer network by hammering the tank farm and the export manifold, ensuring the complex could not simply reroute flow and resume loading by dawn. Delta would isolate the seaward face of the terminal, damage the pier systems, and prevent the harbor from becoming a fallback loading point once emergency crews took over. The entire sequence depended on speed, shock, and simultaneous systems failure. If all 4 effects landed within a narrow window, Sadiq would stop functioning as an export terminal even if sections of the structure remained standing. At 2:41, the Gulf was dark enough that the terminal lights seemed to float without a shoreline beneath them. On the pier, guard teams in hard vests and helmets watched black water and slow-moving harbor traffic, not the higher sky over them. In the inland watchtowers, thermal optics scanned the perimeter road and the berm beyond the fence line. Nothing on the ground signaled immediate danger. The terminal command post logged a routine status check and marked the night as quiet. 3 minutes into the operation, the first signs of disruption appeared as uncertainty rather than impact. A coastal radar sweep returned a brief smear of false tracks over the outer Gulf and then corrected itself on the next cycle. The dock command channel stuttered, recovered, and then broke into overlapping traffic from multiple posts speaking at once. Security officers at the harbor mouth ordered 2 fast boats to remain on standby instead of beginning a scheduled patrol, because nobody yet understood whether the problem was technical failure or intrusion. That hesitation cost the defenders the one thing they could not afford. At 2:47, the opening detonations struck the edge of the complex in quick succession and changed the geometry of the night. A communications mast near the perimeter vanished into a vertical burst of sparks and shrapnel. The primary switchyard flashed white, then orange, and the western half of the facility dropped into darkness except for emergency lighting and the red beacons on the tallest towers. Guards on the pier threw themselves behind bollards and pipe housings as alarms rippled outward across the terminal. The command post finally understood that this was not a systems fault. It was a strike. 6 minutes into the operation, Veyran Revolutionary Maritime Guard officers attempted to impose order across a site already splitting into isolated pockets. The inland response platoon began moving toward the process yard, but traffic congestion at the service road choked its progress. Dock teams activated emergency shutters on the loading control room and tried to cut fuel transfer to the outer berths before pressure fluctuations turned the pier into a fire corridor. Anti-air crews swung their guns upward and fired blindly at empty darkness because no clear target presented itself. Noise rose across the complex, but coordination fell apart. At 2:50, the power block took the next hit, and the facility lost more than electricity. Turbine hall panels blew outward. Auxiliary generators kicked in for only seconds before tripping offline under cascading faults. Pumps feeding the inland trunk line began winding down, then seized under emergency stop conditions that were incomplete, unsynchronized, and impossible to supervise from a crippled control network. In the process yard, heaters failed, pressure warnings cascaded, and the tall columns flashed with emergency flare-offs as operators tried to dump load faster than the system could safely respond. The defenders still had weapons and manpower. The terminal itself was losing coherence. 9 minutes into the operation, the garrison shifted from perimeter defense to pure reaction. Fire crews rolled toward the switchyard and were forced back by arcs from damaged equipment and the threat of secondary blasts. Security detachments abandoned some outer checkpoints and clustered around the central control building because command believed the heart of the facility might still be salvageable if operators could regain a picture of what remained online. At the harbor, the fast security boats finally got underway, their wake cutting hard across the Black Basin under intermittent emergency floodlights. They were moving, but they were moving inside a battle space already shaped against them. At 2:53, the control block was struck, and Sadiq lost the building from which human judgment could have slowed the collapse. Windows blew out in one sheet. The operations floor darkened under smoke and dust as consoles, relay racks, and supervisory control systems failed almost simultaneously. Surviving staff stumbled into the corridor and external shelter points carrying clipboards, handheld radios, and partial printouts that no longer matched the state of the plant around them. Guard officers tried to establish a new command node in a bunker room beneath the security headquarters, but the incoming information was contradictory and late. From that moment on, the terminal was no longer being run. It was merely braking at different speeds in different places. 12 minutes into the operation, the tank farm entered the crisis phase that terminal planners had always feared and never fully rehearsed under combat conditions. Internal pressure systems lost stable regulation. Emergency venting began on multiple tanks, sending vapor plumes into the wind over the western edge of the site. Firefighting foam rigs positioned at the lane intersections tried to establish a defensive belt, but ruptured lines and power loss left them with irregular pressure and partial coverage. Security troops moved to clear roadways for the crews, only to find that debris, disabled trucks, and panicked cross-traffic had narrowed the usable lanes to a single choked route. The terminal still stood, but it could no longer protect itself in a coordinated way. At 2:56, the export manifold and transfer junction were hit, and that blow turned a damaged industrial site into a terminal that could not load product even if the fires were contained. The inland feed corridor ruptured near the shoreward pumping trench. Valve houses collapsed. Transfer pressure dropped to zero across multiple lines as emergency isolation systems locked in contradictory states. On the pier, loading arms froze half-extended over empty berths, and one gangway twisted downward after losing hydraulic support. Officers in the dock control shelter understood the meaning immediately. If the manifold was gone, tankers could not sail in and restore normalcy by morning. The terminal's purpose had been taken from it. 15 minutes into the operation, the harbor finally reacted with visible force. 2 fast security boats cleared the inner basin at speed, their crews scanning the horizon for aircraft they could not see and radioing frantic contact reports that conflicted by the second. Shore batteries on the seawall activated and began firing short, angry bursts toward noise, shadows, and guesswork. Searchlights cut across smoke and reflected off hanging vapor over the water, producing a false wall of glare that made accurate observation harder, not easier. The guards were armed, moving, and dangerous. They were also fighting a battle against uncertainty, while the damage behind them kept expanding. At 2:59, the seaward face of Sadiq took the strikes that would define the night as a partial success rather than a complete kill. 2 outer loading berths were smashed, crane rails were torn apart, and 1 loading arm assembly fell into the water below. A 3rd berth took structural damage severe enough to put it out of service at once. But the innermost loading section, shielded by angle, reinforced support work, and the chaos of smoke already rising from the manifold area remained partly standing. Harbor masters and naval security officers marked that surviving section immediately as the line between a crippled terminal and a dead one. If they could preserve that fragment, they could claim endurance. 18 minutes into the operation, regional response forces began to arrive in pieces instead of as a single organized shield. A pair of fighters crossed the coast too late to effect the strike sequence that mattered most. Inland air defense batteries, receiving incomplete target tracks and corrupted timing, hesitated between relocation and engagement. Command authorities farther north issued contradictory orders: protect the harbor, contain the fires, pursue the attackers, preserve export continuity. On the ground, those instructions translated into confusion and overreach. The defenders were now dealing with the second problem after a strike: not how to stop it, but how to decide what to save first. At 3:02, secondary explosions moved through the western storage area and proved that the damage was not superficial. One tank roof buckled and vented flame high enough to silhouette the entire process yard. Another tank, already weakened by pressure loss and nearby impact, split along its upper seam and sent burning fuel into the containment berm. Fire crews abandoned close suppression and shifted to boundary defense, trying to stop the spread into adjacent units rather than extinguish what could no longer be reached. Security teams dragged hose lines, portable extinguishers, and foam drums through heat and smoke under orders that changed every few minutes. Sadiq was no longer a functioning terminal. It was a series of priority disasters. 21 minutes into the operation, the command bunker beneath the security headquarters started to understand the scale of the economic damage even before the flames were under control. Operators confirmed that process controls were offline, the main export junction was lost, the switchyard was unusable, and at least 3 berths on the pier were dead or inaccessible. Upstream producers called for routing instructions and got none. Tankers inbound to the Gulf were warned off, delayed, or sent into holding patterns. Insurance representatives and ministry officials were already asking whether any berth could still receive a ship once daylight came. The answer, honest and unwelcome, was that one section might survive in a limited state. The rest would not. At 3:05, the outer perimeter finally began to reform under direct military discipline. Reinforcement trucks reached the inland road, dismounted troops spread into sectors, and anti-air crews repositioned to cover the process yard and harbor approaches. It looked like the defenders were clawing back structure. But structure without function could not restore export flow. The troops could guard concrete, steel, and flame, yet none of that returned electricity to the pumps or control authority to the system. Their presence stabilized the perimeter. It did not reverse the outcome. 24 minutes into the operation, the surviving harbor command staff began the first serious salvage plan of the night. Tug crews were ordered to hold back from burning runoff while engineers evaluated whether the innermost loading berth could be isolated and preserved for emergency use later. Divers were discussed, then dismissed. Damage surveys were attempted with handheld lamps and thermal imagers because fixed monitoring cameras had gone dark with the control network. On paper, this was the beginning of recovery. In practice, it was a race to save one fragment of seaborne loading capacity from a terminal whose core systems were already gone. At 3:08, the smoke column rose high enough to be seen from commercial traffic waiting beyond the outer Gulf lanes. Masters on civilian vessels reported the fire glow over marine radio. Regional coast guards redirected shipping farther from the shoreline. Financial markets in distant capitals had not yet opened, but the information that would move them was already spreading from bridge to bridge, from naval channel to maritime desk, from security ministries to energy traders. The defenders at Sadiq were now fighting under second pressure that no rifle or patrol boat could answer. The world had begun to notice. 27 minutes into the operation, the fast security boats looped back toward the harbor because their crews had no meaningful target to pursue and because the terminal behind them required immediate protection. Their return was not surrender. It was triage. One boat took station near the damaged pier to deter any secondary intrusion by sea. The other supported rescue traffic and pushed civilian harbor craft away from floating debris and flaming runoff near the berths. The Maritime Guard had entered the practical phase of defeat, preserving what remained instead of regaining what had been lost. At 3:11, the fire line around the control district was finally held, and that mattered more for the next week than for the next hour. If the blaze reached the administrative archive, the telecom exchange, and the inland fuel reserve for emergency vehicles, the outage could stretch from weeks into months. Engineers, firefighters, and soldiers worked together to prevent that jump. They succeeded, barely, and by doing so preserved the records, communication spares, and staging space needed for reconstruction. That limited success helped explain why Sadiq would later be described as crippled rather than erased. Enough survived to rebuild. Not enough survived to keep exporting. 31 minutes into the operation, the economic map of the strike came into sharper focus than the physical one. The West Tank Line was burning. The central control block was unusable. The export manifold was gone. The power plant and switchyard were wrecked beyond rapid repair. 3 loading berths were out, and a 4th remained damaged but potentially recoverable. Those facts meant upstream production would have to slow, alternative terminals would be overwhelmed, shipping schedules would fracture, and state revenue planners would have to absorb an outage measured not in hours but in a punishing series of days and weeks. The terminal had not vanished. Its function had. At 3:15, regional leadership shifted its language from immediate combat response to strategic messaging. Officials described the facility as attacked but resilient. Maritime Guard spokesman emphasized that one loading section still stood, that harbor command remained in Veyran hands, and that emergency crews were containing the fires. None of those statements were false. None of them restored 612,000 barrels per day of movement through Sadiq. Across the terminal, soldiers stood among wrecked service roads, dark consoles, warped pipe racks, and a skyline of intermittent flame. They had held ground. They had lost throughput. 36 minutes into the operation, the major fires were no longer spreading uncontrollably, and the shape of the final result was fixed. Sadiq would not operate normally at daylight. It would not resume ordinary export flow by the next night. One inner loading section had survived in partial form, enough to complicate the claim of total destruction but not enough to preserve the terminal's role as a primary energy artery. The strike had shut down the complex at its brain, its power source, its storage rhythm, and its export throat. The surviving fragment on the pier was the difference between total ruin and partial survival, and that difference mattered to both sides. The attacking force lost no aircrew and no aircraft. Veyran Revolutionary Maritime Guard and terminal security forces suffered 84 killed and 117 wounded in the strike, subsequent fires, and emergency response across the complex. No fast security boats were destroyed, but their intervention came too late to alter the outcome at the terminal. The facility sustained an estimated $1.9 billion in direct and cascading damage, with an immediate production and export loss valued at roughly $48 million per day. Full destruction of the loading terminal was not achieved. Sadiq produced condensate, marine fuel, and export-grade refined products that financed a major share of Veyran's coastal economy and kept tanker traffic moving through one of the most sensitive shipping corridors in its region. The Maritime Guard believed layered radar, open water, armed harbor patrols, and the sheer scale of the industrial site made the complex too distant, too defended, and too complicated to be shut down in a single night. The strike destroyed the control architecture, the main power system, the storage line, and the export manifold, but one inner berth and part of the loading face remained standing, and that was the honest limit of the result. That night proved a major export terminal can survive as a structure while failing completely as a system.